Hi, welcome to the first lecture for your dual U.S. history class. This first chapter, we're going to be looking at Native American culture and the cultures that existed um, in North America prior, and even in South America, prior to the arrival of Columbus and Europeans. So the first groups that arrived in North America and the North American continent um, are believed to have come over through the, the the Bering Sea land bridge. Um, so when you go back historically far enough, there's the belief that there was a time where sort of what is present day Russia and Alaska were actually linked by land. You could actually walk from Russia into Alaska and then down through Canada. And so our early civilizations that arrived on the North American continent seemed to have spent the majority of their time sort of as nomadic peoples, meaning they were hunter-gatherers. They followed whatever sort of their predominant animal was, right? So if they were hunting buffalo, for instance, as buffalo migrated, they went with the buffalo. Um, After some period of time, and long before we get into sort of the Common Era. So again, like we're talking BCE, centuries before, many centuries before Columbus ever arrives here. A lot of our tribes begin to settle, right? They turn to farming as a means of sustaining life and no longer are nomadic. And so once they begin farming, the most frequent or most common sort of um, crop that's farmed is maize, or what we call corn today. But beans and squash and a handful of others were very prominent among early Native American groups as well. So two of the most prominent Native American groups of North America are actually from what we consider today Central America or Mexico, right? I guess Mexico can count as North America too, just depending on where you want to draw arbitrary lines. But these two societies are the Mayans, who are over here depicted in green on the map. This is the Yucatan Peninsula out into the Gulf of Mexico. Sort of a tourist destination today. But the Mayans had a very advanced civilization. They're one of the earliest examples of an advanced civilization in the Western Hemisphere, and again, long before the arrival of white Europeans. And then the second group that sort of takes over as the Mayans die out are the Aztecs. And so the Aztecs are the ones that settle the area there in goldenrod or yellow or whatever that color is. But they're the ones who founded what is actually now current Mexico City, right? So they had a very rich culture as well, albeit a little bit more of a brutal culture. But they did have aspects of culture, so they had everything from sort of well-developed, nuanced religion to things that we don't even really see in sort of European culture until centuries later when it comes to ideas like leisure, right? So the Aztecs had sort of sporting events that again would have predated sort of what we think of as modern sports today. When you go down a little further south, and again, that's the way the migration pattern happened, right? So when we talk about they're coming out of the Alaska area, coming down through Canada, following various sort of sources of sustenance, proteins. In fact, there's some evidence that Native Americans drove the woolly mammoth far enough south that we've seen sort of skeletons and fossils of woolly mammoths, which if you don't know what they are, those are like massively kind of like like a really hairy elephant, maybe might be the best way of describing them. But they're a very, very cold climate animal, or were. Um, and whether the Native Americans drove them south or if the Native Americans, um, simply were here at a time, um, when obviously the world was a lot colder than what it is now. There's some evidence of them having been hunted all the way down into, sort of what is the southern United States today, which would be way too hot for a woolly mammoth, um, today. But as you continue to go down and you go through, Central America, where the Aztecs and the Mayans had settled, and you get a little bit further south, you get to the Incas, and the Incas were another, um, just wildly well developed, Native American group. So the Incas are right up there with, the Aztecs. And the Aztecs built pyramids, the Incans built pyramids. Um, the sort of advanced nature of their societies is almost awe-inspiring because in some ways, um, you know, a couple like 1,000 years ago or whatever it was, um, in some manners they're as advanced 1,000 years ago as what we are today. Um, and so the Incas are another, pre-Columbian civilization that that's a good sort of indicator of how well society was built up over here, right? So if you look at, Machu Picchu and their sort of religion, and the way that the Incas created, um, sort of really significant roads, and means of commerce, especially through the Andes Mountains, which is a very obviously mountainous region. It's not easy to traverse, not easy to travel through there, even today. And so it certainly wouldn't have been easy to travel 1,000 years ago. And yet the Incas have a substantial sort of road network and a means of, interacting commercially, over significant distance. So Aztec culture, we talked about it a minute ago. They were one of the more brutal cultures of Native Americans. They believed in human sacrifice, for instance. But they are, an excellent example again of sort of an advanced Native American culture. Again, significant building, and architectural advancements, games or leisure was a part of them. That a very intricate, detailed sort of religion, which ultimately ends up coming back to sort of hurt them, um, because they end up seeing the Spanish that come in, as sort of being godlike, and therefore a little less, they're a little more hesitant to, sort of question the Spanish or resist. So when we move to North America and we look at the Native American tribes, um, within what is presently the United States, um, we find some similarities between them. We find that they interacted with one another in many regards. So they had trade, or commerce amongst Indian nations. Some of them had alliances with one another, sort of similar to what you would think of in terms of a military alliance or, sort of diplomatic, um, relations between nations today. Um, but ultimately, they're very diverse. They're diverse in language, in way of life, in culture. Um, but those, um, instances of diversity, especially within regions, are sometimes limited or overcome. Overcome is probably a better way of saying it by, things like marriage. So you could have marriages between, members of different tribes. Not all that different than what you would have seen in Europe, in which, the royal family of France is marrying, somebody off to the royal family of Spain in order to try and have some sort of, um, alliance or semblance of peace or whatever. Um, so The concept, though, of the tribe within the Native Americans is really significant. Tribal activities or tribal sort of um, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, I'm drawing a blank. A tribal identity, right? Like how you identify yourself, like to be a part of that group, that subset, is pretty significant. And so, if you were ever exiled from a tribe for whatever reason, it was pretty devastating. And tribes are also very communal. So, to be exiled or to be sent out on your own would have created a situation very difficult, and it would have been very hard to survive because of this sort of communal aspect of tribes and how they shared responsibility and shared jobs. When you look at gender roles, women in Native American tribes, some Native American tribes were actually maternal in terms of their power structure, meaning um, women were sort of the dominant force. You think about our culture today, right? And a child is born, and that child generally gets the man's last name. It's a very paternal system, right? Meaning sort of men are in charge, or men are the dominant um, gender. There were a lot of Native American tribes where that's not necessarily true. The women had a larger role. In fact, in some Native American tribes, women could be responsible for child care, sort of industry, weaving, making blankets, pottery, um, cooking, farming, all sorts of things of that nature. And especially in your more nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes, where the men were hunting significantly, a significant amount of the duties fell to the women, and the women were relied upon to keep almost society running in that regard. Okay. Um, within the North American sort of a Native American history, we have sort of three distinct periods. So the Adena Hopewell is the first. The Mississippian culture we consider sort of the second age of Native Americans, and then the Anazi are the third um, the sort of era, and that's actually the era that we consider as still being relevant or present today. So that third era would extend to Native Americans that either are fully integrated into American society or still choosing to live on reservations. Um, and so, depending on where you were, the Adena Hopewell is more Midwestern. It's more nomadic. It's more hunter gatherer. Um, you didn't have, in fact, there was a belief at one point in time in history that the sort of what we consider the heartland of America, right, or what we call actually today the breadbasket of America. There was actually a belief at one point in time that it was a vast desert wasteland, that you couldn't grow anything there, that farming would have been unsustainable. Um, and so your hunter-gatherer tribes in that first region sort of dominated what we would consider today Middle America. The Mississippian is obviously a little bit more distinct, so there's a little bit more growing. You have some advances or some varying understandings of religion. Um, the mounds, the burial mounds where natives were laid to rest. And then, like I said, the last one is sort of what's going on today. So that essentially goes, um, you know, from whenever it began, you know, 0 CE or AD or whatever, whichever you prefer to use, whether you want to use Common Era or Anno Domini. But all the way through to today. And there is some overlap in terms of the history or in terms of the eras, because the Anazi are looked at more in terms of sort of Southwest and what we think of as typically more Native American culture today. So if you've ever been to Arizona or New Mexico, there's still a lot of Native American culture that's alive there. To Native American tribes in what is presently the United States. And we start looking at them in 1500, which is again a couple of years after Columbus arrived. Right, what we find is one, some significant regional differences, which is really what we'll talk about here, but also some thriving communities and some large communities. Right, as you can see, there's up to 10 million Native Americans. To put that into perspective for you, 10 million Native Americans, when the United States is founded, almost 300 years later, right? Almost 300 years later, the United States is founded with less than 4 million people. So there's less than 4 million sort of Americans when we found our country in 1776, versus over 10 million Native Americans in North America at the point of arrival for Europeans. So when you look at the southwestern tribes, your southwestern tribes are the tribes that are in sort of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, southwest of the United States. Fairly advanced societies. If you know anything about that region geographically, you know that it's very dry. These Native American tribes there were able to utilize like irrigation systems, so that they could be bringing water into their village, growing corn, things of that nature. The Anazi are the ones that were the Pueblo dwellers, the sort of just the architectural sort of marvel or wonder. They would build into the sides of mountains. They built sort of rather complex sort of structures and dwellings. I mean, they had stair systems and multi-level buildings, which is all pretty sort of impressive, especially given the climate they were living in. When you look up into the Northwest, so sort of present day Oregon, Washington, that general area, again, there's some significant differences geographically, and so there's differences in how the Native Americans lived, right? So up there, especially in the Pacific Ocean, you're looking at fishing and whaling as being more prominent sort of aspects of their lives. Okay. When you look into the Great Plains, for instance, so the middle, what we refer to as Middle America, right? The Heartland area. One of the things that you see is that the sort of Kansas, Nebraska area, those tribes tended to be a little bit more nomadic, right? That's where buffalo sort of roamed freely and was the predominant sort of species in the United States, and so the Native Americans would follow the buffalo, and then the buffalo was really sort of their way of life. So when they killed a buffalo, I mean, obviously they would eat the meat. They used the bones to make tools or weapons. They would use the hide to make blankets or clothing. I mean, there was very, very little waste from the Native Americans in terms of utilizing the actual buffalo carcass. They were very efficient because it was basically what they had. It was how their society sort of functioned. When you get into the Mississippi cultures, so sort of as we move toward the southeast, they're set apart more by their sort of religious ceremonies. So they're what you see with the mound builders, which is what that picture is showing you, which are fairly complex burial sites that were a part of their religious beliefs and ideologies. Okay, the eastern woodlands. So these are the people that would be more mid-Atlantic to sort of New England area today. So we're looking at Maryland, Pennsylvania, all the way up into New York. There's predominantly three groups there: the Algonquins, the Iroquois, and then the Muskegon. And these were some fairly Well-developed societies. The Iroquois had like a Congress, so they actually had a sort of council and a way of um, formalizing relations with other Indian nations, solving problems. Um, when you take a government class, you'll sort of understand sort of the necessity of government. And the Iroquois had a fairly substantial um, system of government at the time. These are also some of the first um, American, or what we call American today, some of the first Native American tribes to encounter European settlers that were coming here. Obviously, given the region, um, they generally farmed. Depending on how close they were to the coast, fishing could have been a significant aspect. They hunted, um, even if they were in for a little bit further inland. Um, River basins and things like that would provide them their water, and again, fish or opportunities to survive that way. Okay, so with the expansion of Europe, so now we're going to sort of shift. So we've seen Native Americans and what was sort of going on here in what we consider the United States today. Now, as we shift and we look at England, um, or not just England, but sort of Europe as a whole, there were factors within Europe that were sort of helping to fuel um, sort of white expansion, right? So when you look at 15th century European changes, you have a massive population, right? So you have expansive population, and one of the things that you'll learn as we move through this course, the native or the settlers, the people that come here, a lot of them are coming in large part because of land, right? Once the population continues to grow in Europe, and specifically in England, which is a very small island, there's just not enough land for everybody. And so land is one of those things that's sort of inherited, and it's very hard to purchase land. Um, so if you wanted to have your own farm, your own homestead, whatever, it's a lot. I don't say it's a lot easier. The passage is not easy, but there's more opportunity in the New World than what there was in Europe. Europe's also created a trade-based economy, right? So as Europeans, whether it was the Italians, the Dutch, the Spanish, Portuguese, English, all of them, as they're sort of exploring um, in the centuries before, they're bringing back goods. They're bringing back things that are not necessarily native to Europe, that the Europeans are finding either useful or luxurious or whatever. And so Europe begins to create a very sort of um, trade-based sort of economic system. It's more than just your general feudal. We all farm locally, and then we give it to the knight or the lord or the duke or whatever, and we get a little bit, and we get protection from that feudal system, right? That feudal system is starting to go away. Um, so you actually have the creation of sort of socioeconomic classes of a merchant class, which is generally what we consider middle class in today's society. Um, but that's all a part of it, right? The Renaissance is a part of that sort of expansion. It's an expansion of the mind. The Renaissance, it focuses on knowledge, on sort of scientific exploration, and so all of that is pushing toward expansion, pushing toward learning about new areas, new regions, new territories. Um, so there's a desire amongst Europeans to further their experiences, further their travel, create better maps, create better understandings of the world. You have some technological advances in terms of like the compass, that make it easier to travel. So if you don't know anything about a compass is basically a magnetic instrument that points to the North Pole, so you know what direction you're going, north, south, east, or west. Prior to that point, the way that it was done was with the North Star, and if you understand anything about sort of celestial navigation, or you understand anything about our Earth is obviously moving, right? And not only does it move, it also sort of rocks or tilts, right? Which is why we have summer versus winter and whatnot. What that means is that if you're basing your navigation off the stars, while they are very similar in their location, they're not always exact. Now, when you're talking about traveling from, England to the United States, it's you're going to get there, right? Like you're going to get there with celestial navigation. But if you set sail in England and you're aiming for, say, Long Island, you might miss Long Island by, 100 miles, 50 miles, just depending. The compass makes that a little bit better. Again, the increased travel and expansion of travel creates better maps as well. What had happened is that prior to sort of the Columbus expedition, trade or sort of the way that trade worked is you had the land route, and you probably learned about this in a world history class, where you're sort of going from Greece, Constantinople, Istanbul, whatever, so Constantinople, or it used to be called Constantinople, it's called Istanbul today, is sort of what we see as the marker between Europe and Asia, right? So there's a little strait that goes through there. So basically, there's a massive, massive city, and the city is split almost right down the middle. And half of the city, the western half of the city, is considered sort of European, and the eastern half of the city is considered Asian. Right, and so even if you look today, like the eastern half, the Asian half is a very Muslim area of Istanbul, and the western half is more sort of Christian or Greek Orthodox based. And the land routes were slow; they weren't wildly efficient, and so increasingly what you saw people trying to sail in order to get where they were trying to go. And so initially what happens is they're sailing south along sort of Africa, right? They come around the Horn of Africa, Cape Good Hope, whatever it's called down there, right? So the southern tip of Africa. Then they come up into the Indian Ocean, right? And they find India, and then they get into China and sort of the other Asian nations that way. And so the better your sort of exploration, the better your navy becomes at that time, the more sort of economic opportunity you have, right? So the better your ships, the better your navigation, the better your maps, the better your trade is going to be, because your trade is going to be more efficient. And so we see sort of the rise of, it's probably, you make the argument that it's early globalization, right? It's the first sort of attempt at globalization in which you're traveling around the globe, you're trading with other nations. And then that also sort of creates the idea of sort of nation states, right? And your ports become wildly significant. They're cultural centers. They're not just trade. They're not just economic, but they're cultural, meaning there's sort of exchanges in how we live lives in that regard as well. So Columbus, right? We've all heard the story of Columbus. We know Columbus is an Italian. He's not sailing under the Italian flag though, because he's got to get his voyages paid for by some government, right? So his idea is to instead of sail down around Africa, he thinks he's going to cut some time off of his trip by going west and sort of circling the globe that way. Don't believe some of the hype that Columbus was this great forward thinker who was the only one that knew the world was round. That's not true. That's a sort of story that was told to you in elementary school that's not accurate. Um, did he have any idea how far he was going? No. Did they have any idea how large the Earth was? No, not really. But they knew it was round. There was not some superstitious belief amongst the majority of his crew that they were going to fall off the edge of the world, right? Yeah. So just so you understand, you go all the way back to 1492, and we all knew that flat earthers were idiots. All right. So. So Columbus sails west, and he arrives in what we call today the West Indies. So he arrives in the Caribbean after a much longer journey than what he anticipated. And so again, if you look at a globe at some point in time, one of the things that you'll realize is the Atlantic Ocean is very, very small compared to the Pacific Ocean. Columbus, if North and South America were not here, Columbus would have sailed straight across all the way to Japan or China or wherever he would have landed. And the estimate that he had for how long this journey would take him was just wildly off. So when he arrived in the Caribbean, he had actually thought he had gone a lot further than he needed to arrive in China. Which is sort of a fascinating concept. Okay, after Columbus's voyage, multiple other voyages began. Columbus sort of dies actually penniless because he's still looking for India and Indian spices and some of these things that he thought he would find from Asia. And obviously, he never arrived in Asia, and so he couldn't find what he was looking for, which was ultimately detrimental. America itself is actually named after a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, so that's why you've got a different name than Columbus or North and South Columbia or whatever. Vespucci is the one who sort of realizes that what Columbus has found, because obviously, remember, Columbus hit the Caribbean, right? So he hit islands. He knows he's in islands, okay? So there's a thought that what Columbus had hit was just like Hawaii, right? Like, it's just a small island, and if you keep going a little bit, you'll hit China. Vespucci is sort of the one who figures out, like, no, dude, this is a massive continent. Like, this is not some little chain of islands. And so, as he begins to make maps, we name America in his honor. Okay, so this just gives you some of Columbus's voyages. He did make multiple voyages over the course of time, and he made multiple voyages because obviously he's continuing to go back and look for the riches, the gold, the spices, the things that he set out for initially. What happens after Columbus is you end up with the sort of age of exploration expanding. So as Vespucci figures out, as we all figure out, the United States or the North and South America exist. And now, again, we don't have enough land in Europe. We're going to expand our land, and so we basically have sort of right of discovery, okay, which is probably wildly detrimental to the natives that were living here, because natives didn't really have sort of a concept of land ownership. Like, they had territories, and they had like their hunting grounds and their burial grounds, and there was some sacred aspects to that, but they didn't buy and sell land the way white folks did. So the right of discovery here is the idea that when a European explorer comes and sets eyes on some new land, he's going to claim that land in the name of whatever flag he's flying under, because he didn't finance his trip himself. His trip is financed by somebody. Right, so Cabot is flying under the English flag, so he establishes portions of North America for England. Other people are setting off for other reasons, right? So like Ferdinand Magellan, for instance, he's credited as being the first one to circumnavigate the globe. He doesn't make it, but he hits the New World, right? He hits the Americas, sails down the east coast of South America, goes through what's now called the Strait of Magellan, down there at the tip of South America, the southern tip of South America, and starts off into the Pacific. And obviously he's in the Pacific for a long time, eventually lands in the Philippines, gets involved in a little skirmish there, dies in the Philippines. But the rest of his crew ends up making it, and they get back to, I think he was flying under the Portuguese flag, if I remember correctly. So the Protestant Reformation, this is another one of those things that's going on in England that's going to have some profound impacts. So for sort of centuries in England, the Catholic Church has been the predominant religious entity. They wield a significant amount of power. The Protestant Reformation is in fact, Protestant means to protest, right? They're protesting behaviors of the Catholic Church, and it begins sort of with Martin Luther's 95 Theses that he nails on the church door. John Calvin is another reformer who is going to sort of look at some of these aspects of Catholicism and begin to question whether or not that's really sort of how God intends things. And so you end up with Lutheranism and Calvinism and now sort of Protestantism is this big umbrella that encompasses Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, like all sorts of different religions. It's all beginning right around this time as a result of sort of some general questions as to the behaviors of the Catholic Church over centuries, right? So the part of this is a result of the printing press being printed, and the number one bestseller in the world is the Bible. People are actually reading the Bible for the first time themselves, which didn't used to happen. It used to be read essentially to you, or it was told to you by a Catholic priest. So if they have the knowledge, if they have the book, they can sort of dictate the message. And so people are coming out of that. They're not quite okay with that anymore. And so the Protestant Reformation is going to lead to some other issues, right? So in England, for instance, you have the Anglican Church, right? You have issues with, I believe it was Henry the Eighth. I think it was Henry the Eighth, who's trying to get divorced. Divorce is not okay in Catholicism, right? So you have religion, which is a large aspect of life, in a state of turmoil, right? And so again, some of this comes out of the Renaissance and this idea of knowledge, and knowledge is being so important now, and we're trying to learn, and so scientific knowledge sort of is a natural sort of means of questioning things. And so now we're starting to question religion as well, and this is going to be important because it leads to the Puritans and some of the people that are coming to the United States, or I keep saying the United States, but to the New World. So the Spanish Empire is massive. We'll cover this real quickly because it's not really a part of U.S. history. So they're generally further south. Probably doesn't surprise you. That's why Mexico, they speak Spanish. Central America, they speak Spanish. Most of the Caribbean, they speak Spanish. But the Spain had the best navy at the time, right? So the Spanish Armada is the predominant navy of the world. And so Spain is able to travel the world a little bit better. They have their conquistadors or conquerors that are actually sort of setting out, looking, for lack of a better term, to just pillage the riches of the New World, right? Like by force. Cortez, Pizarro, these guys are basically sailing to the New World, disembarking from their ships. They brought horseback, right? They brought horses. They're traveling via horseback. Some of the natives, I think the Aztecs were one of them, because horses were not native to North America, thought that the man on the horse was one entity, like one being, one beast. Um, but they travel throughout sort of Central and South America, um, conquering Native American tribes, and they have sort of superior firepower. Um, they have the means. Although, as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, the Aztecs um, also sort of misunderstand the intentions of the Spanish initially, which is one of the reasons why the Aztecs were overwhelmed. Okay. Um, there were instances of Native American tribes that were at war with one another, sort of trying to abide by that concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So they're looking at figuring out how to use the, the Spanish to aid them in their wars against their enemies. So what we get is the growth of sort of Spanish America. And so they create the encomienda system, which is a way of basically granting land and titles and privileges to people that are loyal to what the Spanish want. You see the introduction of African slaves coming over as a part of that triangular trade. There were instances in which Europeans tried to enslave Native Americans, and as a general rule, it was very, very unsuccessful. Native Americans, obviously, one, they resisted, and anybody resists enslavement. Enslavement's not a good thing. But because it was sort of enslavement in their backyard, they knew the land, they knew the territory, they knew where they could get away to, they knew who would hide them. So they were able to escape a lot more frequently than what African slaves were, because they were brought from another continent, and there's no sort of systems in place to aid them, right? They don't know where to go, they don't know the land, they don't know what's a mile or 2 miles down the road. The Catholic Church plays a predominant role in expansion as well in Spanish America. So you probably learned at some point in time in a class about the Spanish missions, right, and the church that's trying to come in and promote Catholicism, and trying to convert convert natives to Catholicism, right? And it doesn't just happen here in America or in the New World. Like, Catholics do that in a large variety of places, right? There are some instances, right, with like Bartolome de las Casas, who was a priest who's trying to, for lack of a better term, trying to be more priestly, right? Like trying to actually treat natives like human beings, which doesn't always happen. This is a picture of what one of those missions would look like. I don't recall off the top of my head where this one is from, but very southwestern sort of adobe architecture. So you're probably looking at Mexico or southwestern United States. This map just gives you an idea of where some different Spanish explorers went while they were in the New World, right? So whether it was, the blue is Cortez, right? Cortez is the one that deals with the Aztecs. I think that color is purple. Down there in South America, that's Pizarro, or maybe that's black. Yeah, maybe that's black, whatever. But the one down there to the south, or in South America, that's Pizarro. He's the one that encounters the Incas, the Incan civilization. Ponce de Leon is the one who sort of establishes what's Florida today. I apologize for that. But so Ponce de Leon is the one who is established basically what is Florida today. So that just gives you an idea of some of the people and where they were traveling. The Columbian Exchange, this is the sort of trade center, right? But it's not just trade, right? So when you look at sort of the idea here of exchange, yes, we exchange like plants and animals. So like horses, which were native to Europe, not native to the United States. Like horses come over, corn going back. Um, Obviously, some exchanges of peoples. There were some natives that were taken back to Europe because obviously they looked different, and so it was kind of like a Ripley's Believe It or Not, like a sideshow. You had smallpox diseases, um, that are transferring from one group to the other. But basically, the idea of the Columbian Exchange is just every sort of trade, whether it's actual like commerce trade or trade of like immunities and diseases and bacteria. But the Columbian Exchange is sort of the idea of everything that came out of or switched, right? Like things that went from Europe to North America or from North America to Europe. The Spanish exploration, again, Spanish is a little bit different than the English idea, right? And so that's why you have a difference between sort of Central and South America as what you do for North America. The encomienda system, which we already talked about, is one of those. The hacienda system is another, right? So the hacienda system is actually what replaces the encomienda system, and so you're looking at sort of trying to create wealth, and really more of a colonization aspect, right? So we're trying to now begin not just explore, not just figure out what's out there, but now we're going to colonize it and we're going to try to manipulate it for economic gain. When you look at the Southwest, um, again, we talked about this. The Catholic missions are really important there. Um, the the idea of um, sort of the expansion of Catholicism um, is something that matters for the the Spanish, for the Europeans, right? They're trying to um, civilize. I guess we equate religion to civility in a lot of regards, although there's also sort of like um, general attitudes amongst Europeans, amongst white people, that their culture is more civilized for a wide variety of reasons, and so in order to civilize, like it's really just an indoctrination to be more um, like us, right? And so some of the Native American tribes, um, some of them abide by this sort of Spanish idea. They're more accommodating to the Spaniards that come in. Others, there's some revolts as well, like Pope's Rebellion. Um, so he's a religious leader for the Pueblo, and basically is trying to remove the Spanish from the New Mexico area, right? Um, so obviously, with any time you introduce sort of new people and they're trying to change culture and life, um, there's a lot of times where there's pushback. Um, Pope is significant because they actually kind of whooped the Europeans. Probably one of the worst defeats that the Spanish had in the New World. Horses in the Great Plains. So once horses are introduced here, they actually they take real well to North America. They populate the Midwest. They're actually like wild for a long time. I don't think we have a lot of wild horses anymore. For the most part, they've been domesticated. But in the Great Plains specifically, because the Great Plains are really flat, the horse becomes really significant. It helps with trade. It helps with travel. Native American tribes in in the Great Plains region become really, really adept at riding horseback and shooting bow and arrow at the same time, right? So they utilize them for warfare. Um, the horse makes buffalo hunting significantly easier because now they can um, basically they can travel as fast as the buffalo can, which obviously they couldn't before. Some French exploration or some French aspects of what's going on. So the French come as well. Um, oh, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the river now. But the French find I think it's the St. Lawrence River that is essentially a border region between the United States and Canada today. But they actually come in and they believed, and I think it was Cartier who believed this, that he could find sort of a gap in the massive continent, right? Like he thought that he would be able to find a river that would take him all the way through rather than having to go all the way south like Magellan did. And he thought he found it because the St. Lawrence River brings you into the Great Lakes, which are massive. Like you almost feel like you're back out in the ocean once you get into the Great Lakes. But what it does is it sort of puts the French over the Appalachian Mountain region, right, from where the English settle. And so the French established some forts out there. They became very good at trappers. They become very good trappers, right? So they trap animals. They get pelts and fur and things like that. And so the French fur trade becomes really, really significant. In fact, the French basically have a significant influence in two places, right? So one is Montreal, which is what we sort of refer to as French Canada today, and then the other is in New Orleans, right? And so when they come south, they'll establish New Orleans as a massive port, and there's obviously still some French influence to New Orleans today. This is just a map that shows you the variety of exploration routes for the English, the French, and the Dutch. We already talked about the Spanish. The Portuguese come as well. If you ever really want to understand like Brazilian history, Brazil is actually predominant. Brazil speaks Portuguese. It's the only nation in the Western Hemisphere I know of that speaks Portuguese. Um, but so there's more than just the English, the French, and the Dutch. I want you to understand that. Some challenges to the Spanish Empire. So the Spanish are the first ones that sort of colonize and create an empire. We talked about the Spanish Armada, mentioned the Spanish Armada already, right? That's their navy. It's the best navy in the world. And so it allows them to sort of control the seas. And if you control the seas, you can control trade, you can control sort of the exchange of knowledge or ideas. You get to dictate a wide variety of things. And so the Spanish are in control for quite a while. The British do try to overtake this, and there is a fairly significant naval battle in which the British defeat the Spanish Armada, which was sort of shocking to the world at the time, or would have been shocking to the world at the time if we had like breaking news. And so it's what gives rise to sort of the English dominance as an empire. Right, the arrival of the English in Virginia. So once England sort of gets into everything that's going on, their first attempts are Roanoke, which is in Virginia. They put some people in. Basically, they drop some people off. The ship goes back to England. When it comes back, and it takes, you need to understand, like a single trip takes like 2 months, right? By the time they come back, that civilization, like that little colony that they built, is just gone. It's up and disappeared. We think we know today that there was some serious drought that occurred. You can probably assume there was a little bit of warfare, some skirmishes with the natives around there, but they were just ill prepared, right? And so by the time they return, I think it was 2 or 3 years later, that colony is missing. All right, so that takes us to the end of sort of, or it takes us up to sort of the English settlement of North America, which is which is what we wanted to get to and where we wanted to start. So this is the end of chapter 1. Hopefully this helped a little bit. Still a work in progress. Obviously, you're noticing that I had to do this in multiple different settings, which is why there's a different shirt on. So if you didn't notice that, yeah, I was wearing a gray shirt at the beginning of this, and now I'm wearing a maroon one. But hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, please contact me, and I'll answer them as soon as I can. Thanks.